So, this is a general lecture on critical theory, and in particular how it applies to education and to schooling to schools as social institutions. And it builds off our previous discussion of economic structuralism and the work of Bowles and Gintas and the correspondence theory. So we can begin with a brief summary of 4 different approaches to educational research, or 4 different paradigms of educational research. The first is what Apple refers to as Michael Apple in his book Ideology and Curriculum refers to the academic approach. And the academic approach as a research paradigm is grounded in what we have defined as empiricist social science. And its interests are in academic performance, differentiation and stratification within education. Primarily, it's an attempt to understand and predict what yields the greatest amount of academic productivity via schooling. So, in other words, what are the variables that have the most impact on students' success or failure, and groups of students' success or failure in school. And that includes study of the unequal distribution of resources, the influence of background of students, the social class, race, ethnicity, gender have an impact on student performance, etc. So the goal is really to maximize productivity through schooling. This has been a dominant part of this program has been effective research on effective schools in terms of the production of learning and academic success in schools. A second paradigm or approach, which is grounded in interpretive social science, is the socialization approach, and that explores the social norms and values that are taught in school. That is, it explores how schools socialize students into the dominant and accepted norms and values of the society, which are commonly socially accepted and shared in the society. So what kind of effectiveness is involved in socialization processes in schooling? A third economic educational research approach is, as we discussed last time, was economic structuralism, and that was grounded in empiricist social science. Centered around the identification by Bowles and Gintas of the correspondence principle, that the structure of the social relations of production are mirrored in the social relations of schooling, and that explains and predicts performance of students based upon their social class background, and that the school functions as an agent of social class reproduction through the mechanism of correspondence. So it's an attempt to predict and explain empirically the persistence of educational inequality, the persistence of the relationship between family wealth and income and educational attainment. And then a third research program is, in general, the critical theory approach, which is the subject of our discussion today. That the critical theory approach is based in a critique of all the other the three other approaches, the academic and socialization approaches. The critical theory maintains that both the academic and the socialization approach are non-reflexive, in the sense that both approaches take for granted, that is, they do not reflect upon the assumed social, economic, political, and educational beliefs, values, mythologies, etc. That is, the ideology that undergirds school knowledge, the curriculum, the organization of schooling, and its functioning. That is, they uncritically assume or accept the social order and its legitimacy, and do not question that social order, do not question its justification, do not question its legitimacy. And the critical theorists maintain that that is a core problem with those approaches. They're assuming too much, and thereby a part of the reproductive mechanism of the school system. They also offer a critique of economic structuralism. They reject structural economic determinism. That is, they reject, more specifically, the correspondence principle. They argue that it might be valid, but it doesn't tell us enough, and it doesn't account for the role of ideology in maintaining the economic structure of capitalism. As Apple writes on page 2, it cannot, quote, it cannot illuminate fully what the mechanisms of domination are and how they work in the day-to-day activity of school life. The focus then should also be on the ideological and cultural mediations which exist between the material conditions of an unequal society and the formation of the consciousness of the individuals in that society, end quote. In other words, critical theory wants to look into the black box, if you will. They want to understand how the correspondence theory might work, and what would support the mirroring of the social relations of production in the social relations of schooling. In addition, economic structuralism is grounded in the idea of property or economic capital as the main determinant of social class, and the main mechanism through which social class is reproduced. And they neglect, it is argued, they neglect symbolic property, or what has been referred to as cultural capital. And Apple again writes, understanding how institutions of cultural preservation and distribution like schools create and recreate forms of consciousness that enable social control to be maintained without the necessity of dominant groups having to restore to overt mechanisms of domination. So social control and the persistence of an unequal school system and an unequal society is maintained not exclusively through economic determinism, but is bolstered by a set of belief systems. And therefore, one of the keys to understanding this is the concept of ideological hegemony, which is central to critical theory, which we'll discuss in a minute. The general orientation of critical theory, therefore, is based on the claim that social interests, economic, political, social class interests, etc., are hidden or tacit or implicit within the ideological discourse of society. And that's the central idea of ideological hegemony. And that requires an immanent criticism to demonstrate how the premises of a dominant worldview represent the values of the existing order. And the purpose is to explore and clarify the interests and values that existing ideologies and institutions tend to keep hidden in order to evaluate them. Also, that modern societies tend towards alienation and reification. Alienation is that they produce a disconnect or a separation from one's own power as a person, disempowering persons, as well as alienation from each other, from other human beings. And also, modern societies tend to tend towards reification, that is the objectification of persons and thereby the dehumanization of persons. So a part of the purpose of critique is to uncover the belief systems that are leading to alienation and reification, and how that's perpetuated in modern societies. Turning to the idea of ideological hegemony, ideology has at least three categories. Ideology can refer to specific justifications of the activities of specific groups, like professional ideologies. The ideology also refers to broader political programs and social movements, kind of the political ideology of various movements. And then ideology can also refer to comprehensive worldviews, how we make sense of the world. And ideology can be understood in two ways. One as, and they are not mutually exclusive. One is that ideology functions as a system of symbols that provide ways of making sense of the world. They function as shared meanings that make social reality understandable. And or ideology can function as a form of false consciousness, which distorts one's picture of social reality and often will serve the interest of the dominant classes in society. And that ideology functions as to legitimate or to justify group action and social acceptance. So it seeks to sanctify existence by bringing it under the dominion of ultimately right principles. And here we could make a distinction between valid and invalid justification, and that ideology may function as to legitimate injustice may function as invalid justification that should be rejected upon critical scrutiny. So ideology, in other words, is a system of beliefs and values that tends to justify the existing order. Ideological hegemony, therefore, is the domination or the presence of a dominant ideology in society. And that hegemony acts to, and this is a particularly important idea in critical theory, hegemony acts to saturate our consciousness so that the world, the social world, becomes, we begin to accept the social world as the only world that can exist. It becomes reified, or through ideological hegemony and its saturation, we can't imagine or conceive of alternatives to our current reality, and therefore and this is a point made by Antonio Gramsci, who developed a theory of ideological hegemony, an Italian theorist who died in a fascist prison, died in one of Mussolini's prisons for his critical thought. But Gramsci noted that the dominant ideology as a saturation of the people's consciousness defines or constitutes the limit of common sense for most people. It seems as the ideology and the explanation of the world is so accepted that it becomes common sense, and therefore difficult to dislodge from people's minds. And that ideological saturation tends to permeate our lived experience and organizes the common person's sense of the world, and generates the belief that they are neutral participants in neutral social institutions, that there's not an agenda implicit in those institutions, that there are not economic, political, and or ideological interests that are hidden or tacit within social institutions. So the function of ideological hegemony is to keep hidden or unreflected upon the basic ideological assumptions of the social order, its beliefs and values. And this constitutes, and this isn't in the reading as such, but relates directly to what Johann Galtung, a sociologist and one of the founders of peace research, identified as cultural violence. And I wanted to point to Galtung's idea here, and it's very similar to ideological hegemony, that and involves the symbolic sphere of life, our beliefs, our values, our assumptions, that justify and legitimate direct or structural violence, and thus render them acceptable in society. So culturally violent ideologies are those that make direct and structural violence look right or feel right, not wrong, not questionable. It renders them normal and natural, or even invisible to most people. And that structural violence is is another term for structural injustice, that structures of unequal and unfair economic, educational, and political opportunity are in place. And that results in structural violence results in status subordination for specific groups of people in society based upon their race, their gender, their social class, maybe their sexuality, maybe they're religious, maybe they're a religious minority as well. So from the perspective of critical theory, educational institutions play a very important role in the society. And it's from the perspective of critical theory, it is maintained that the school is a main social institution for the transmission of and the preservation of ideological hegemony. It's part of a systemic mechanism that reproduces the cultural and economic order of the society. And that through educational school institutions, meanings are reinterpreted, diluted, put into forms which support or don't challenge the effective dominant culture. And that school curriculum therefore centers around a consensus ideology. And the reality, so schools are operating from this perspective. They're functioning as cultural institutions that select, preserve, and distribute a particular social construction of the society, which may not serve the interests of everyone, may favor the interests of certain groups of people in the society. Now, this is the role of educational institutions as a transmitter of ideological hegemony, functions through a selection process. And of course, education involves a selection and organization of social knowledge that forms any particular curriculum. And that's necessary to have any kind of educational system. Someone must select. This could be selected democratically or by a ministry or one person or a group of people. Need to select what is considered to be the most valuable kinds of knowledge, because we can't teach everything, right? So education involves necessarily a selection of what is to be taught. And the principles upon which selection and organization of knowledge are based are linked to the institutional parameters of the schools, as well as the institutional structures, the larger social structures that the schools are embedded in. And that selection involves, therefore, social, conscious and unconscious social and ideological choices. And they give legitimacy to particular types of cultural resources. And this would vary across different societies. But the general tendency is for the selection to mirror the dominant beliefs and values of an elite social class, or at least the middle class. Therefore, critical theory concludes that curricular knowledge, that is the knowledge that forms the curriculum, is not neutral. And this is a key point, that any curriculum won't be neutral, that social, in the sense that social interests are embodied in that knowledge, that the curriculum reflects and is an active force in reproducing the dominant ideology. So the selected cultural capital, in other words, which is stored in schools, it functions as a filtering device in the reproduction of a hierarchical society, is the claim, is a theoretical claim. Now we have to look at that, how school knowledge is, what school knowledge reflects, and how it functions to advantage some students and disadvantage other students in terms of the distribution of cultural capital, as well as the kind of cultural capital that students from different social backgrounds bring with them to the school. So there's a whole number of research questions that emerge out of this theoretical approach, as well as a research methodological approach. Some of those questions would include why and in what ways are specific aspects of the culture presented in school as objective factual knowledge. That's something to be researched. Or whose knowledge is it? Whose knowledge is being reflected in the curriculum? Who selected it? Why is it organized in a particular way? Why is it taught in a particular way? And does that vary across different social groups? Questions revolving around the linkages between economic and political power and knowledge made available to students or not made available to students. What political, social, ethical, and economic interests and commitments are uncritically accepted? What social and economic groups and classes are helped by the way the social institutions are organized and controlled, and which groups are not benefited? Which particular kinds of students get what particular kinds of knowledge? Is there a differentiation in the kinds of knowledge that different groups of students are exposed to? And in what ways does schooling create a credentialing process based on the possession of the cultural capital that's aligned with labor needs? Is there the creation of a credentialing process based on cultural capital? That would be a research question. Others, how do schools legitimate these limited and partial standards of knowing as unquestioned truths? How do the basic day-to-day regularities of schools, that is, the hidden curriculum, the tacit teaching of norms, values, and dispositions, contribute to students learning the dominant ideology? Or in other words, what role does the hidden curriculum play in perpetuating the dominant ideology of the society? And what ideological and epistemological commitments do educators and teachers tacitly accept and promote by using certain models and traditions of curriculum and knowledge traditions. So these are some of the questions that emerge out of a critical theory perspective, mainly focused on what are the ideological processes involved in schooling as an agent of reproduction. Given those research questions, what follows is a particular research approach that necessarily involves going into schools, necessarily involves observation in schools, interviews with students and teachers, etc. To examine the basic regularities of the school experience and what covert ideological teaching goes on because of them. So how is the dominant ideology being reflected in and advanced and maintained by particular kinds of teaching, by the curriculum, by the organization of the school, etc. What commitments are embedded within the curriculum, and what underpins our way of thinking about planning and evaluating the school experience. And this, from Appel's point of view, Michael Appel's point of view, this involves a relational analysis, which is a central research methodology here, that we critically study the relationship between ideologies and educational thought and practice, which includes the study of a range of common sense assumptions that guide curricular selection, and that situates the knowledge, the school, and the educator within the larger social context, which determine the knowledge and the organization of the school. So it's the research approach is to examine how school knowledge is generated out of ideological and economic conflicts outside of the school as well as inside the school. It also involves or is grounded in a set of normative commitments that may be accepted, socially accepted, but based on ideologically grounded common sense. And critical theory is in part grounded in and reliant upon a valid conception of justice, and a conception of justice is normative in nature. And this will lead us to an investigation of the methods of normative theory construction. What would constitute a valid justification, and a basis of critique for invalid justifications of conceptions of justice. So in summary, critical theory maintains that there are social interests hidden within the ideological discourse of society, and that takes the form of ideological hegemony, which tends to define common sense. And the school functions as a means of reproducing the social order through the perpetuation of ideological hegemony. The purpose of critical theory, therefore a critical theory research program, is to explore and clarify the values and interests that existing ideologies and institutions, including schools, tend to hide, so that we can evaluate them, so that we can evaluate their validity. And in doing so, it adopts both a conceptual and an interpretive approach that's in a critical vein. So I would situate critical theory and its research program under the guise of interpretive social science. It's an attempt to understand the experience of schooling and how schooling functions and its meaning in society. Thank you.